There is a sound that every parent dreads more than any other. Not a scream, not a crash. Silence. The kind of silence that arrives in the middle of a sentence, when a voice you have known since the day it first cried out simply stops and does not come back. For Brian and Annette Swanson, that silence came at roughly 2:30 in the morning on the 14th of May, 2008. They were in their pickup truck, somewhere on the dark, rural backroads of southwestern Minnesota, driving through the flat, endless farmland that stretches for miles in every direction out there. Their 19-year-old son Brandon was on the phone. He had driven his car into a ditch on his way home. He wasn't hurt, and he was walking through the fields toward a cluster of lights he was certain would lead him back to safety. His father was talking to him the whole time, guiding him, keeping him close through a thin thread of cellular signal. And then, 47 minutes into that phone call, Brandon interrupted himself. 2 words. Oh shit. That was it. After that, there was nothing. No struggle, no cry for help, no explanation. Just an open line stretching out into the Minnesota night, and a father saying his son's name over and over into a phone that would never answer him again. In the days that followed, searchers would bring in bloodhounds. Those dogs would pick up Brandon's scent near where his abandoned car was finally found, and they would follow it. 3 miles across the fields, west and north, past an abandoned farm, down to the banks of the Yellow Medicine River. And there, at the edge of that fast, cold water, the trail did something that has haunted this case ever since. It reached the river, and then it stopped. That was more than 17 years ago. Brandon Swanson has never been seen or heard from since. His body has never been found, and to this day, no one, not his family, not the sheriffs of 3 different counties, not the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, can tell you what those 2 words meant, or what walked out of the shadows to meet him in that field. This is the story of a young man who vanished while talking to his own father, in a place his parents could not find, in a case that changed the law of an entire state. This is the search for Brandon Swanson. Before we walk this trail any further, I want to know, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments below. Somewhere out there, someone watching right now might live near those fields between Taunton and Porter. Someone might have driven that stretch of Highway 68 1,000 times, and that person might know something they don't even realize they know. To understand what was lost that night, you have to understand who Brandon Swanson was, because he was never just a case file or a missing persons poster. He was a son, a brother, and a young man who had his whole life mapped out in front of him. Brandon Victor Swanson was born on the 30th of January 1989 in Marshall, Minnesota, to his parents Brian and Annette. Marshall is a small city in Lyon County, in the far southwestern corner of the state, a place of open sky and farmland, a community of somewhere around 13 or 14,000 people, the kind of town where the horizon runs flat and unbroken to the edge of the world. It was home. Brandon grew up there surrounded by family, including a younger sister named Jameen. By every account from the people who knew them, the Swansons were a close family, and Brandon was, in the words of those who loved him, a loving son and a loving brother. He was, by his family's description and that of his friends, a friendly, intelligent, outgoing young man. He had a genuine love of learning. Science in particular drew him in, and when he graduated from Marshall High School in 2007, he made a choice that says a great deal about the kind of person he was. Rather than rushing off, he chose to stay home with his parents for another year and enroll close by, at the Minnesota West Community and Technical College campus in Canby. There, he pursued a certificate in a field that was, at the time, still very much on the cutting edge: renewable energy. Brandon was studying wind turbines. In a part of the country where those white towers now turn slowly against the sky for as far as the eye can see, Brandon was training to build and maintain the future. And he had plans. Big ones. That certificate was only the beginning. Brandon had been accepted to continue his education at Iowa Western Community College, more than 250 miles from home. For the first time in his life, he was going to strike out on his own, live away from his parents, and step into the wider world. By all accounts, he wasn't dreading it. He was excited about it. He was looking forward to the opportunity to build his life, to further his education, to become the man he was working so hard to become. That is the detail that matters most about Brandon Swanson, and the one that would shape everything investigators came to believe about his disappearance. This was not a young man who wanted to run. This was not a young man in crisis, hiding from a life he couldn't face. This was a 19-year-old standing right at the threshold of everything he had been working toward. A young man with a healthy body, no known history of mental illness, a supportive family, and a future he was genuinely excited to walk into. Physically, Brandon was slight, around 5 feet 6 inches tall and roughly 120 to 130 pounds, with brown hair and blue eyes. He wore glasses. He was the kind of young man who, if you passed him on the street, you might not look at twice. And that ordinariness is part of what makes his story so unsettling. Because what happened to Brandon Swanson didn't happen to someone reckless, or someone lost, or someone looking for trouble. It happened to a bright, careful kid a few weeks from the next chapter of his life, 7 miles from a home where the porch light was on. Now that you know who Brandon Swanson was, a real person, with a family who loved him and a future he could already see, I want to ask you something. Does he remind you of someone in your own life? A son, a brother, a friend just starting out? Tell me in the comments. These cases stay alive because people refuse to let the names fade. Keeping Brandon's memory alive matters. The 13th of May 2008 was a Tuesday, and for Brandon Swanson it was a milestone. It was the last day of classes for the academic year at Minnesota West. His certificate program was finished. The long commute to Canby was behind him. Ahead lay the summer, and then Iowa. For a 19-year-old, it was exactly the kind of night that calls for celebration, the end of one thing and the beginning of another. Brandon stayed out that evening to mark the occasion with friends. Accounts describe him attending gatherings that night in the small towns of the area, time spent in Lynn, near his home, and time in Canby, roughly 35 miles away, where his campus was. At 2 different gatherings that evening, Brandon was seen drinking. But this is a detail that has been carefully examined, because it matters. His friends, the people who were actually with him, consistently reported that while they saw Brandon drink, he did not appear to be visibly intoxicated when he left. He was not, by the accounts of those present, dangerously drunk. He wasn't a known heavy drinker. And crucially, his own father would later say that during the long phone conversation that followed, Brandon did not sound disoriented or confused. He sounded like himself. Sometime before midnight, Brandon left Canby to make the drive home to Marshall, a trip of about 30 miles, a route he knew well, a drive he had made over and over as part of his daily commute to school. On a normal night, the direct way home would have been Minnesota State Highway 68, the main road connecting Canby and Marshall. But that night, for reasons that have never been fully explained, Brandon did not take the highway. He chose instead to drive the rural farm roads, the gravel back roads that lace through the fields of southwestern Minnesota like a grid laid over the earth. Why he chose the back roads that night, no one can say with certainty. It is one of the small mysteries folded inside the larger one. What is known is that somewhere out on those dark gravel roads, north of Highway 68, in an area of flat farmland that all looks very much the same in the black of a rural night, Brandon's car left the road. His Chevrolet Lumina slid off into a ditch at the edge of a field. He wasn't hurt, but the car had come to rest hung up on an incline, the wheels lifted just enough off the ground that they couldn't grip, couldn't find traction, couldn't pull the vehicle back up onto the road. Brandon was stuck. Just before 2 o'clock in the morning, he did exactly what any of us would tell our own children to do. He called home. Brian and Annette Swanson woke to the sound of the phone. Their son was on the line, telling them he'd driven into a ditch, that he was fine, but that he needed them to come and get him. And here is where the geography of that night becomes so painfully important. Brandon told his parents that he believed he was near Lynn, a small town roughly 7 miles southwest of Marshall. He wasn't certain. He was somewhere on unfamiliar back roads in the dark, and in that vast, featureless farmland, losing your sense of direction is not hard to do. but Lind was his best guess. So Annette and Brian got up, got into their pickup truck, and drove out into the night toward Lind to bring their boy home. And they kept him on the phone the entire way. The call dropped occasionally, the way calls did out there in 2008, and each time it did, they called him back. Brandon stayed with his car and tried to help them find him, flashing his headlights on and off, hoping his parents would see the signal cutting through the dark. His parents did the same, flashing their own lights, scanning the roads. But neither of them saw the other. Brandon couldn't see his parents' lights. His parents couldn't see his. They were, somehow, searching the same night for each other and finding nothing. Finally, Brandon made a decision. He could see lights in the distance, a glow that convinced him he was close to Lind, close to town, close to safety. He told his parents he was going to leave the car and walk toward those lights on foot. He told his father to drive to the parking lot of a local bar in Lind and wait for him there, and that he would meet them. Brian agreed and turned the truck toward Lind, talking to his son the whole way. So Brandon started walking, out of the ditch, away from his car, into the fields, toward lights he believed would lead him home. He talked to his father as he went. At one point he mentioned passing fences. He mentioned hearing water nearby. And then, at some point shortly after 2:30 in the morning, 47 minutes into that phone call, Brandon Swanson interrupted whatever he was saying and exclaimed 2 words. "Oh shit," and then he was silent. Brian kept talking, kept saying his name. The line was still open, but there was no one answering on the other end. Eventually the call ended, and Brian and Annette began frantically calling back, again and again, into the small hours of the morning. The phone rang, no one picked up. Their son, who had been in their ears just moments before, who had been walking toward lights that meant home, was simply gone. They did not go home and go to sleep. They kept searching through the darkness themselves, driving the roads, calling out. They reached out to Brandon's friends, who joined in searching the rural area for any sign of him. The night wore on toward dawn, and there was nothing. No Brandon, no answer. Nothing but those flat, silent fields. At 6:30 that morning, having found no trace of their son, Brian and Annette Swanson did the only thing left to do. They called the police. What happened next is, in many ways, the heart of why this case matters so much, and why it changed Minnesota law forever. When the Swansons reported their son missing to the Lind police that morning, they were not met with the urgency they were desperate for. Brandon was 19 years old. He was, legally, an adult, and in 2008, that distinction meant a great deal. The Swansons were told that it was hardly unusual for a young man that age to stay out all night after the last day of college classes. Annette Swanson would later recall, with a clarity that never faded, that one of the officers told her it was Brandon's right to be missing. "I'm his mother," she would say, "and I knew something was horribly wrong." She was right. But the machinery of a missing adult investigation moved slowly in those first crucial hours. Later that morning, the Lind police did begin a search, but they found no trace of Brandon in the town or anywhere around it. They called in the office of Lyon County Sheriff Joel Dahl for help. And to try to narrow down where Brandon actually was, the sheriff's office did something that would completely upend everyone's understanding of that night. They obtained Brandon's cell phone records. What those records revealed changed everything. Brandon had not been anywhere near Lind. His phone had been connecting through a cell tower far to the northwest, in the vicinity of Taunton, along Highway 68, the main route toward Canby. He was roughly 25 miles from Lind, in an entirely different direction from where he had believed he was. All that time, while he told his parents he was near Lind, while he walked toward lights he thought were the edge of that town, Brandon had actually been miles away, in a completely different part of the county. Whether Brandon himself ever knew how wrong he was about his location, that is something no one can answer. He may have died believing he was almost home. Working from those cell records, deputies searched the area near Taunton, and on the afternoon of the 14th of May, they found Brandon's car. His Chevrolet Lumina was sitting in a ditch off a gravel road, out along the Lincoln County line, about a mile north of Highway 68 and roughly a mile and a half north of Taunton, right in the borderlands where three counties meet. The discovery of the car in that spot pulled a second sheriff's office into the case, that of Lincoln County Sheriff Jack Vizecki. The car itself told a strange, quiet story. It was hung up on an incline at the edge of the road, exactly as Brandon had described. Not damaged in any serious way, but tilted just enough that the wheels on one side couldn't reach the ground to grip. There was no damage suggesting a violent crash. Inside and around the vehicle, there was no blood, no sign of a struggle, no indication that anything violent had happened there. No alcohol or drugs were found in the car. But two details stood out, and they have never stopped troubling investigators. The car's keys were gone, not in the ignition, not in the car. And the ground around the vehicle, grass and gravel, held no footprints. There were no tracks, nothing to show which direction Brandon had walked when he left his car and set off toward those lights. He had simply stepped out into the dark and vanished from the record. Investigators worked to pin down his last known position more precisely. The final call had been routed through a cell tower near the intersection of County Routes 3 and 10, close to the town of Minneota, along Highway 68. By the 15th of May, the call had been narrowed to within about 5 miles of that tower, and searchers began to concentrate their efforts inside that circle. Because part of that circle reached north into Yellow Medicine County, authorities from that jurisdiction were pulled in as well. 3 counties now were part of the search for one 19-year-old. Sheriff Dahl offered one theory about the lights that had lured Brandon into the fields. From out in that area, he noted, you could see a red light atop a grain elevator in Taunton. Dahl thought it was possible that the red light Brandon saw glowing in the distance had convinced him that Lind, and safety, was within walking distance. If that is true, then Brandon walked toward a light that was never going to lead him home, across country that was nothing like what he thought it was. The search that followed was enormous. Ground teams combed the fields. An aerial team flew over the area from above. Search dogs were brought in from the Twin Cities. And then came the Bloodhounds, a team from Codington County, in nearby South Dakota. Those dogs found something. Near the abandoned car, they picked up Brandon's scent and they followed it. The trail ran roughly 3 miles, largely along the field roads, heading west and north, until it reached an abandoned farm. From there, the scent continued on, down to the Yellow Medicine River, and it led to a point where it appeared to go straight into the water. This is where the drowning theory was born. Brandon had told his father, in those final minutes, that he was passing fences and that he could hear water nearby. Now the dogs had traced him to the edge of a river, and the Yellow Medicine River, on the morning of the 14th of May 2008, was not a gentle stream. It was running high and fast with spring runoff. In some areas nearby, in Lincoln County, the water had been as much as 10 feet deep that morning. The river has a steep bank and, in the dead of a moonless night, in unfamiliar country, a person walking toward it could easily fail to see the drop coming until it was too late. On that theory, that Brandon might have walked into the river and drowned, the search shifted to the water. Boats from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources were put in along the river. Gates were installed to catch anything the current might carry downstream. Deputies walked the riverbanks on foot. Horses and all-terrain vehicles worked the surrounding land. And when the organized searches wound down, Sheriff Vizecki did something that speaks to how deeply this case gets into the people who touch it. Every single day, for 30 days straight, he personally walked 2 miles of the Yellow Medicine River, looking for any sign of Brandon Swanson. They found nothing, not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not the missing keys, not a body. The river had led the dogs to its edge, and then the trail had simply ended at the water, and the water gave nothing back. You've now seen everything the investigators had in those first days. The ditched car with the doors open and the keys gone, the footprints that didn't exist, the phone call that put Brandon 25 miles from where he thought he was, and the scent trail that ran all the way to the river and then stopped. Before I walk you through the theories, I want to hear yours. What do you think happened to Brandon Swanson out there? Drop your theory in the comments. I read them. Here is why the Brandon Swanson case went cold, and why it has stayed cold for the better part of 2 decades. It is not that no one searched. It is that everyone searched, exhaustively, and the ground gave up nothing. Start with the river, the most obvious answer, and the one that the physical evidence keeps refusing to confirm. If Brandon drowned in the Yellow Medicine River that night, then where is he? The problem is simple and stubborn. Investigators searched that river intensively for years, and a body in a river tends to be found. It surfaces, it moves downstream, and catches somewhere, and is discovered. But no matter how thoroughly the Yellow Medicine was searched, with boats, with gates, with divers, with deputies walking the banks, Brandon never surfaced. Over the years, that fact hardened into a serious objection to the drowning theory. If he had gone into that water, many involved in the case came to believe he should have been found by now. The river was searched again and again over the years, in ways that most cases never are. In 2021, southwestern Minnesota was gripped by drought, and the Yellow Medicine River ran completely dry. Authorities took advantage of that extraordinary window and excavated the riverbed itself, searching the exposed bottom directly, in the very stretch where the dogs had once traced Brandon's scent to the water's edge. They found nothing connected to Brandon Swanson. The river, given every chance to answer, stayed silent. Then, there is the maddening absence of physical evidence anywhere else. No footprints near the car, no tracks to show a direction of travel. The keys, simply gone. And here is a detail that complicates the drowning theory even further. According to reports on the case, Brandon's cell phone remained switched on until the 16th of May, 2 days after he vanished. A phone that stays powered on for 2 days is difficult to square with a person who drowned in a river within minutes of his last words. The scent trail itself refuses to give a clean answer. Yes, one of the dogs traced Brandon to the point where the trail entered the river. But Annette Swanson has pointed to something crucial about that trail, something that keeps her from believing her son drowned there. After following the scent to the water, she has said, that dog crossed to the other side of the river and kept going, up the far bank, along another gravel road, continuing north toward the Yellow Medicine County line, where the trail finally ended. If the dog's nose is to be trusted, then Brandon didn't stop at the river. He crossed it. There really is nothing to indicate that he's in the river, Annette told CNN. And then there were the very human, very practical obstacles that hobbled the search on the ground. This is farm country, and the land is owned and worked. As the search dragged on into planting and harvest seasons, some farmers were reluctant, and in some cases refused, to allow search teams and cadaver dogs onto their fields, particularly when crops were in the ground. That left significant geographic holes in the search, gaps in the map that were never fully covered. Fields were planted just after the disappearance, and the ground couldn't be effectively searched again until those fields were harvested in the fall. The search became seasonal by necessity, a stop-and-start rhythm dictated by the agricultural calendar rather than the needs of the investigation. And there was the jurisdictional tangle. Brandon had vanished in the borderlands where Lyon, Lincoln, and Yellow Medicine counties meet, and at various points all three were involved, along with the Lind police. In those early days there was no single clear lead agency, no one office with undisputed authority over the whole case. That confusion, the Swansons came to believe, cost precious time and coordination in exactly the moment it mattered most. The searches continued through the seasons, resuming each fall after the harvest, picking up again each spring after the snow melted, but before planting. That cycle went on through 2011. By then, an astonishing area had been covered. Some 122 square miles of southwestern Minnesota had been searched for one young man. Over the years, hundreds of volunteers gave up days of their lives. Dog handlers came from multiple states, and still, the fundamental fact never changed. No body. No physical evidence. No answer. In 2010, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the state's lead investigative agency, took over as the lead on the case, bringing state-level resources to bear. It set up a dedicated tip line. Tips came in. By 2015, some 90 leads had been reported through that line. The area of interest gradually shifted over the years, moving away from the original stretch of the Yellow Medicine River and toward Mud Creek, a tributary north and northwest of Porter, where at times searching dogs had continued to pick up the scent of human remains in areas that hadn't been searched before. But every promising direction eventually ran into the same wall. Leads were followed, ground was searched, and Brandon Swanson stayed missing. That is what cold really means. Not that people stopped caring, but that every honest road ran out. So what are the theories? There are several, and each has to be held up honestly against the evidence, because none of them has ever been proven, and no one, including law enforcement, has ever been able to say for certain which one is true. The first, and for years the leading theory, is accidental drowning. In this version, Brandon, walking through unfamiliar fields in the pitch dark, hearing water nearby and passing fences just as he'd told his father, walked toward the sound and the shape of the land and stepped over the steep bank of the Yellow Medicine River without seeing the drop. The river was high, cold, and fast that morning. His two final words, "Oh shit," would fit a man who suddenly felt the ground vanish beneath him. The dogs traced his scent to the water's edge. On its surface, it is the theory that fits the most pieces. But that's just theory one, and there's a real problem with it. If Brandon drowned in that river, his body should have been found. That water was searched for years, with boats and gates and divers, and in 2021, it was even excavated bone dry during a drought. Nothing. On top of that, his phone reportedly stayed on for 2 days afterward, and one of the tracking dogs didn't stop at the river at all. It crossed to the far bank and kept going. Does that change how you're leaning? Tell me in the comments which way you're now looking. That leads directly to the second theory, death by exposure. In this version, Brandon did reach the river, but he crossed it, just as the dog's trail suggested, climbing up the far bank, soaked, cold, and exhausted, in the small hours of a Minnesota spring night. And then, somewhere out in those miles of empty farmland, hypothermia and exhaustion overtook him, and he lay down and did not get up. It would explain why he isn't in the river. But this theory has its own problem, and it's a serious one. If Brandon died of exposure somewhere in those fields, his remains should still be out there, and cadaver dogs, working the area for years, should have found them. The unsearched gaps left by the farmland and the seasons offer one possible explanation for how a body could go undiscovered. But after 122 square miles and years of dogs, it remains difficult to accept that he could still be lying somewhere out there, undetected, all this time. The third theory is foul play. It cannot be ruled out, and law enforcement has been careful never to rule it out. Sheriff Vizecki himself raised the possibility in plain terms, imagining that someone could have been out there in the dark. Someone could have been in the shadows, he speculated, and they got him that way. Brandon's abrupt final words, the missing keys, the total absence of a body after nearly 2 decades of searching. To some, these point away from a simple accident and toward the possibility that another person was involved. And yet here, too, the evidence works against certainty. Investigators have consistently said they found no evidence of foul play. No blood, no signs of a struggle at the car, no witnesses, no means, no motive. Nothing to suggest an abduction or an attack. Foul play remains possible precisely because so little is known, but there has never been a shred of evidence to confirm it. And the fourth possibility, the one his family rejects most firmly, is that Brandon walked away on purpose, that he staged his own disappearance to start a new life somewhere else under another name. Investigators and analysts who have studied the case consider this extremely unlikely. Staging your own permanent disappearance takes planning and sophistication, and there was no evidence whatsoever that Brandon was planning anything of the kind. Far from it. He was excited about Iowa, excited about his future, embedded in a close and loving family. And there is the phone call itself. To vanish deliberately, Brandon would have had to keep his own father on the phone for the better part of an hour, faking a car in a ditch, faking his confusion about his location, faking the very moment of his own disappearance, all while planning to abandon the people he loved without a word. Everyone who knew him found that impossible to believe. His family finds it impossible to believe, and so it sits at the bottom of the list of theories, technically unable to be disproven, but running against everything known about the young man at the center of it. 4 theories. not one of them complete. Each one solving part of the puzzle and breaking against another part. That is the terrible shape of the Brandon Swanson case. A mystery where every answer creates a new question, and where the truth has stayed just out of reach for more than 17 years. This trail has been cold now for over 17 years. But cold cases do get solved, sometimes after decades, sometimes when a single new tip or a single new piece of technology cracks something wide open. If you've ever followed a case that finally got answered, tell me about it in the comments. Those stories matter, because they're the reason families like the Swansons are able to keep hoping at all. Today, the case of Brandon Swanson remains open and unsolved. He would be in his mid-30s now. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension has served as the lead agency on the case for well over a decade, and the Lyon County Sheriff's Office has never closed the file. In the years since, the case has drawn national attention through true crime podcasts and documentaries, and each new wave of coverage brings the same result the tip line has always brought. The leads keep coming. As recently as 2026, 18 years after that night, the Sheriff's Office confirmed that tips about Brandon Swanson still come in. Investigators still don't know what happened to him, but they are still listening. The searches, too, have never entirely stopped. The 2021 drought excavation of the dry riverbed was only the most dramatic of many efforts that have continued across the years, each one an attempt to close the gap in a map that has stayed stubbornly incomplete since 2008. And through all of it, Brandon's parents have carried a grief that has no shape and no ending. Annette Swanson once named it precisely. They call it ambiguous loss, she said. The particular anguish of losing someone without ever being allowed to know what happened, without a body to bury, without the terrible mercy of certainty. Brian Swanson has spoken about it just as plainly. "I'm pretty sure we're not going to find him alive," he admitted. "But I still want to believe that we will find him. That's probably a stretch, but I still want to believe that." On the night Brandon vanished, the Swansons turned on their porch light. And they left it on, every single night, for years, a small beacon burning in the dark of southwestern Minnesota, a signal to a son walking toward lights, in case he was still out there somewhere, trying to find his way home. "There's no reason to turn it off now," Brian said. Out of their unbearable loss, Brian and Annette Swanson built something that has protected other families ever since. Haunted by the fact that they had been told their son had a right to be missing, that his adulthood was treated as a reason to wait rather than to act, they set out to change the law. Annette met with a local state legislator, Marty Seifert, and told him everything that had gone wrong in those first hours. She knew, she said, that it wouldn't bring Brandon back, but it could help someone else's child. Seifert introduced a bill. A companion bill was carried in the state Senate by Dennis Frederickson, and in May of 2009, with the Swansons and their daughter Jameen standing in attendance, Governor Tim Pawlenty signed Brandon's Law. The law took effect that July, and it rewrote how Minnesota responds to a missing person. Police can no longer refuse to take a report simply because someone is an adult, or because not much time has passed, or because the person might have left on their own. Law enforcement is now required to begin investigating promptly, to determine whether a missing person may be in danger, to notify neighboring agencies quickly, and to clearly establish which agency is in charge, fixing the very jurisdictional confusion that hampered the search for Brandon across 3 counties. Several other states have since passed similar laws. Seifert, years later, kept the pen the governor used to sign it. "I consider it one of the most important bills I authored in my 14 years, he said. "It will save lives. Somewhere out there, people have been found faster, and families have been spared the Swansons' agony because of a young man named Brandon, whose own family was told to wait." That is Brandon Swanson's legacy. But it is not the answer his family still needs. Because somewhere out in those fields between Taunton and Porter, along the banks of the Yellow Medicine River, or across it, or somewhere no dog has ever walked, the truth about that night still exists. Someone may have seen something on those back roads in the early hours of the 14th of May, 2008. Someone may know something about the red light Brandon walked toward, the water he heard, the 2 words he never got to finish. And even after all these years, that someone could be the reason this trail finally warms. If you have any information about the disappearance of Brandon Swanson, you can contact the Lyon County Sheriff's Office at 507-537-7666 or the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension at 877-996-6222. No detail is too small. No memory is too old. A family has kept a porch light burning for the better part of 2 decades, waiting for a son to walk back into it. Brandon Victor Swanson was 19 years old. He loved science and the wind. He was weeks away from the future he'd built for himself. He was talking to his father, walking toward the light, certain he was almost home, and he deserved to make it there. Somewhere in America, this trail is still cold, but someone out there remembers something. If that someone is you, make the call. If this is your first time walking a trail with us, subscribe and follow along, because there are more names and more families still waiting for someone willing to follow the evidence to the end. Leave a comment, share Brandon's story, and keep the light on.